Welcome everyone to Zaagibagaang Live. Thanks to everyone for joining us today. This is a session of our Get Involved, Get Informed Watch Party series. Thank you for joining us. So we're broadcasting here live from Fond du Lac Tribal and Community College as we usually do. And I know it takes people a minute to get logged on, so I'll just go ahead and start with a little bit of background on Zaagibagaang. And as you start getting logged on, if you can just say hi in the comment box, that helps us know that you're logged on. So Zaagibagaang, I'll read our mission statement. Zaagibagaang is a grassroots effort focused on governance and nation building. With our Anishinaabe teachings guiding us, we bring our gifts together to provide information and to work towards Minabamadaziwin today as well as for the next 7 generations. So this is our mission of our work. You can find out a lot about Zaagibagaang on our website, zaagibagaang.com, about all the people that participate in the group as well as a host of educational information, videos, and more. So I'm Jill Dorfler. I'm your host for today for the program. And so once again, we're broadcasting here from Fond du Lac Tribal and Community College. Thank you to Liz, Jacqueline, and her whole team here for getting us, getting all our technology worked out. It takes a lot to get everything organized for these sessions, so we appreciate that. It's a nice, cool spring afternoon here at Fond du Lac today. And our topic this afternoon is going to be the formation of the Minnesota Chippewa tribe. And then maybe as we get time, a little bit about that first constitution and how it was organized compared to the major changes that came in 1960s. So last week we had a really great session on sovereignty. Before that, we also had sessions on pre-MCT kinds of governing structures, our 7 values and teachings. And if you missed any of those sessions, they're available both on our Facebook page and on our YouTube channel. So please check those out. So I think we have some people logging on here, but I think we can go ahead and probably launch into the program. So welcome once again. I'm Jill Dorfler, and we have David DeGroat with us today. And so the way it's going to work for our session today is the same setup as we've used in our other sessions, where I'll start by giving the floor to David. He'll take about 20 minutes or so to give us a lecture on the formation of the Minnesota Chippewa tribe, a little bit about our historic band structures, how that changed over time with reservation structures, the Nelson Act. Squeeze in as much as we can in 20 minutes. And then after that, as he's talking about those topics, please do start writing your questions in the comment box, and then we'll move into a Q&A and take as many of your questions as we can. So miigwech to David DeGroat for joining us here today and for sharing his thoughts on this important topic. David, I'll let you introduce yourself and I'll give the floor to you.
David DeGroat. I'm instructor at White Earth Tribal and Community College, where I teach a variety of law and history classes. I'm also an adjunct professor at UMD Duluth, where I teach tribal leadership, mainly in the MTAG program. And then I'm also a judge at White Earth Tribal Court. And talking about the formation of the MCT, you know, the easiest place to start, and especially lecture-wise, is with the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, because it's kind of a codification. It kind of lays out a groundwork in a template for it. The origins, I think, go back more to a federal Indian policy called assimilation policy, and a federal law um, called the Nelson Act that affected Minnesota in particular. And Nelson was under the umbrella of another federal law called the Dawes Act, and that is often called the Allotment Act because it led to the allotment of lands. But a more maybe long-lasting component of the Dawes Act was the assimilation policy and the attitudes that went with it. And there, I think, different kinds of bands, and historically, some historians have described some bands as being geographic and cultural, and some people have hinted that some of the bands have been described by the federal government in such a way to aid in treaty making. And other people have described the bands as having more of a comprehensive common culture. So the treaty that established White Earth in 1867, that's with the Mississippi Band. And the Mississippis were generally located in around Brainerd, Minnesota, Gull Lake. But shortly after the 1867 treaty, other bands began to move to White Earth. If you've ever been to Mahnomen, Minnesota, that's Pembina Township. In 1873, I believe it was, the federal government purchased Pembina Township from the Mississippis for the settlement of the Pembina Band, and a band of the Ojibwe that was generally from the Red River Valley. So there's always been this kind of really interesting ebb and flow of our definition of bands and the federal government's definition of bands. And skipping back to the IRA, I think there's a similar ebb and flow in the federal government's attitude towards the establishment of the IRA. And I think you can have two different opinions, I think, that are both valid. And I'm not just saying that because I don't want to make people mad, but I think you can have two kind of different opinions on whether a band should be a tribe or whether the 6 bands together are a tribe, are the Minnesota Chippewa tribe. And some of the evidence seems to suggest that the federal government, John Collier in particular, assumed that each band would be a tribe. And local BIA officials, and the person most often mentioned is a guy named Frank, I think his first name, but Frank Mandel, who indicated that, well, White Earth, Leech Lake, Fond du Lac, Grand Portage, we've always had connections. We've always kind of had band connections, and it's always been like an extended family. And he indicated to the BIA at that time that, no, he thought we should all structure under what some people would describe as a confederated tribe. Now, there's a counter to that, is that other people say that that structure was put in place primarily to aid the BIA. And early on, the tribes started out calling the reservations not RBCs or RTCs, but charters. So each reservation would have a charter, and maybe similar to a corporate charter or something like that, but each reservation would be chartered. But there's always been an issue of how much power does each reservation have versus how much power the MCT as a confederated tribe has. And those issues started, I think, around the first votes for the IRA, and some people saying, so I believe our delegate from White Earth was from Nadawash, and his name was Frank, and now I can't remember his last name. But he raised concerns with the first charter vote that the local reservations wouldn't have enough control of their land use, and they would know best how to put those resources to use. And so subsequent charters, they were structured more with a kind of a federalism kind of system, with the MCT and the TEC having certain separate powers, but the RBCs having extensive local powers as well. So Article 2, I believe, or Article 4, I believe, of the Constitution, powers of TEC, and Article 6, powers of the RBC, they have a lot of similar powers. And under the Constitution, the RBCs have a right to negotiate with the federal government for services and programs, just as the TEC. So I think because of that kind of historic, intermingling of bands throughout Minnesota, and especially throughout northern Minnesota, those same kind of issues just manifested themselves in a different political way around the time of the IRA. And one of the interesting parts of talking about the IRA and how they treated the formation of our government, initially, especially the Constitution, which, by the way, most people indicate our Constitution was written by Frank Mandel and somebody else from the BIA.
Mandel.
Jacob Mandel.
Yeah.
You got a better memory for names than everybody's a Frank to me. So was our Constitution written really with a lot of local consultation? Does it reflect our traditional Anishinaabe values? And is that an issue that's manifested in different ways in our history since 1934? And is that something we should take into consideration? And one of the leading ways I think that arguably might have been manifested is in the first major amendment in the early 1960s, the Enrollment Amendment. And there's one TEC meeting minutes in particular that's really interesting on that subject, because I think it gives insight into the attitude of the BIA at that time. And one of the TEC members, John Pemberton, indicates that we have to do this 1/4 enrollment. Part of the 1/4 enrollment was about distributing settlement funds from the United States government. So that was part of the reason he said we have to do that. Does that kind of go back to the argument that the IRA is structured more for the BIA bureaucracy than for our well-being? I think you could make that argument. But he goes on after that discussion to make a real interesting statement, and it's that if we don't do this, the BIA is going to do something anyways, and maybe it'll be something we won't like as much. So BIA isn't exactly consulting with us about key component of our sovereignty, who are members of the Minnesota Chippewa tribe. So stepping back to assimilation policy effectively terminated the political power of many tribes, and yet there was still a kind of a governmental structure in many places like White Earth, but they were more reflected in like the Chippewa Claims Commission between early 1900s and 1934. So there was always like some local tribal leadership that the federal government consulted with bureaucratically, it seems. However, they weren't structured as an official tribe according to the U.S. government until 1934. Now that attitude, it's kind of a dismissive, patronizing, hierarchical attitude towards our sovereignty. I think that little statement from John Pemberton about the BIA, they're going to do this anyways, no matter what we say, really reflects a negative side of that attitude, really reflects a kind of a hardcore version of that attitude. And this, he would be talking about the period around the late 1950s and the early 1960s, which is also called the Termination Period. So interestingly, about 20 years after their strengthening sovereignty through the IRA, they're terminating a bunch of tribes. So that attitude expressed in that 1961, does that mean that the IRA really wasn't the turning away of assimilation policy that it was sold to us as being? That we're going to reverse assimilation, which in the 1920s even the federal government deemed a disaster? Or is it just a different kind of assimilation? And as our history progresses through, public and legal policies, I think that's always in the back of people's minds. Is this just a modern day manifestation of discovery doctrine? Is this just a modern updating of assimilation policy? We tribes that aren't Public Law 280 or even that are Public Law 280 cannot prosecute non-Indian defendants for very serious crimes within their borders. And that sounds a lot like the same attitude of assimilation policy. Even on the civil side, for a tribe to have jurisdiction over a non-Indian, there has to be some really tough to meet exceptions that are met. And those exceptions are articulated in a U.S. Supreme Court case called Montana. So in other words, in Indian country, race matters as far as jurisdiction. If we're in Minneapolis, there's no question of jurisdiction over us. They don't say, oh, he's native, we don't have jurisdiction. However, in Indian country, essentially race matters because of that membership issue. So has the federal government really revolved out of assimilation policy, or do they just kind of put a different gloss on it as the generations go? And the IRA and the constitutions out of the IRA, I think that's a perfect place to kind of examine that evolution and that structure. And even with what we have with our different band system, it raises those issues.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much. So I think you raised some good points and issues as we look at, definitely the change in membership and citizenship that happened in 1961 when John Pemberton is explaining it. the Minnesota Chippewa tribe had, of course, passed many resolutions on lineal descent, and the Secretary of Interior kept rejecting those. And so, back to your point about like sovereignty and that being respected at the Bureau, that Secretary of Interior approval clause definitely goes pretty hard against the idea of sovereignty, that this outside entity would be having some kind of approval.
Yeah, and it's questionable whether that approval authority is explicitly even in the IRA. Now it's written into our
the Constitution several times.
But how about if we didn't have it in our Constitution? Would there be an argument, well, the IRA mandates it? It doesn't seem to mandate it. So that goes back to kind of maybe the IRA and the constitutions that come out of it. They were more meant to, you know, facilitate the bureaucracy than really to revitalize our communities.
Mm-hmm. Just to help everyone get an understanding of the way that 1936 MCT Constitution, about how it was set up, can you talk about how people were elected at that time? We had a kind of House-Senate style system, I would potentially describe it as, but how would you describe the governing body, that original governing body, before those big changes in the 60s?
Now, if I remember, it was still a single chamber body, if I remember correctly, but it didn't have the TEC and the RBC reservation structures. It had the charter structure instead.
It has a charter structure, but I'm thinking of the way that the Minnesota Chippewa tribe had the system of delegates that was by population for each reservation, and then the TEC.
Yeah, and so it more looked like the United States Articles of Confederation, but also our apportionment, like House of Representatives, I guess would be the best example, right? So it wasn't necessarily just 3 local council members it was based on, but and this might be a rumor because these things happen, but I've read some, and I think that Natowash delegate said it, that, well, everybody else was mad at White Earth because if we did it that way, we would have way more delegates because White Earth had the highest population.
Yeah, so for all those years between 1936 and until the big changes in 63, White Earth had way more delegates because White Earth, even at that time, had a larger population, just like White Earth continues to have a larger portion of the population of the Minnesota Chippewa tribe as a whole. So during those initial years, White Earth had way more delegates and could control, to some extent, votes in the delegates, what was called the tribal delegates. But then we still had the same system for the TEC, where it was the Senate, what we might call the Senate-style system, where there was 2 representatives for each reservation.
Yep, the chairman and secretary-treasurer.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is interesting. The 50s, to me, in teaching that class is kind of challenging because there isn't, I don't know if there isn't much that went on, but if there isn't a lot of record of it. And I suppose that's because Congress was passing laws to terminate tribes. So, and I don't know if that apportionment system is fairer, or if the system we have now is fairer. I guess that's a matter of opinion. I think the most distinctive thing about ours is the TEC versus the reservations that have a lot of power. The reservations have a lot of independent power that looks like tribal power, but really the tribe is a Minnesota Chippewa tribe. So in the federal charter, the Minnesota Chippewa tribe lists all 6 bands and says that's a tribe. Yeah, and I don't know, like I said, the Mandel kind of hinted that it was because of historical things coming out of, the local relocation policy in the Minnesota to move everyone to White Earth. We've got representatives about every band in White Earth. Or whether it was this is going to make it easier for the BIA if we just have one tribe instead of 6.
Yeah, and like a lot of these historical things, it's probably a combination of factors.
Yeah.
It's never like one big linchpin.
Well, it
Oftentimes,
tells a better story if it's just here's the good guys and here's the bad guys.
right, we can make a nice timeline and sketch everything out, but typically it's not that simple. And I think you're right. There's probably, there's a motivation on the part of the Bureau of Indian Affairs for expediency and ease, and dealing with one governing body would definitely do that for them. But then because of the way bands and reservations have formed over time, those political bodies have changed. They've always changed, even before reservations were established. Bands were changed over time. But then when we move into the reservation era, I think those things become fixed in a way. And then, I don't know, maybe you can disagree. That would be great. But the reservations, then we also talk about reservations today as bands and also as nations. And so we're kind of mingling our political terminology. And we see the federal government do that too in certain ways. But
and it's, and a lot of federal writings, like in other laws, like Appropriations Act, around the time of the Nelson Act, they call Nelson a treaty too, when it's actually a federal law. And so I think that, I think that's, everybody can kind of get them labels mixed up.
Yes, and I think it would be great if you would say a little bit more about the Nelson Act, as that directly connects back to John Pemberton and that 1/4 MCT blood quantum that we get in 1961. And he's connecting it back to the Nelson Act, which they were expecting to get a payout of at that time, which we know it took decades longer than that. But maybe just say a little bit about the Nelson Act. And
and I think you're right. Pemberton was actually talking about some of the settlements we just got recently in, early 1960s. So like swift justice from that.
the Bureau was slow.
Well, I think, and it's kind of interesting. I think you can talk about blood quantum in framing that question, and blood quantum, I think, first became a leading issue in White Earth, or a critical issue in White Earth, because of Nelson, because the Nelson Act is an allotment act that, broadly takes communally owned reservations and makes it into individual ownership. And part of the allotment process is through individual allotments to eligible tribal members. Part of it is for excess land is allotted to non-Indians, corporations, and individuals. So White Earth only has 8% of its original reservation today. I think Leech Lake is even less, like 5%. And then the Nelson Act, what they did to White Earth too is they lopped off the 4 northeastern townships right away. So right away you had, I can't do the math, but you had about 1/5 of the original reservation that was divested. And those allotments were originally had 25-year trust periods, where the trustee, the Indian allottee, could not freely sell the land because we were considered legally incompetent due to our race. However, the rule developed in the early 1900s that if you're one drop of non-Indian blood, you are legally competent. So the term mixed blood became like a property law term in White Earth.
Yeah.
And so essentially, if you were mixed blood, the state could argue that you're subject to tax forfeiture. A bank could argue that their mortgage is valid and can be enforced. And, you know, it's a story a lot of people are probably familiar with already, but it was one of the hugest Indian frauds in United States history, and just extensive fraud in just about any way you could think of to defraud natives of their land was done. So there were false affidavits drafted that, yep, this person is mixed blood. People were put on the rolls to get allotments who may have been absolutely zero Indian blood. And there's a story out of the Lennon-Moorhead investigation from 1909, and it may be apocryphal, it may have some truth, but one of the elders in White Earth went to apply for his allotment, and he went to the allotment office, 8 in the morning or whenever they told him to, and they told him, we're not ready for you yet, come back later. And when he came back later, there was already a line, and one of the first people in the line is a little clearly non-Indian girl who turned out to be from St. Paul, and her parents had sent her up on the train to get an allotment because she had an affidavit saying we're part White Earth. And so different, every way a professional thief could think of taking somebody's land through fraud was probably done following the Nelson Act. And it centered around blood quantum. And behind that picture is the attitude of social Darwinism, is the attitude of scientific racism, that why would we be competent with a drop of non-Indian blood all of a sudden? Because our Indian blood, according to social Darwinism, is inferior genetics, and therefore we are incompetent. And don't have time to really go into it in detail, but it's a whole weird, bizarre, like hierarchical structure that they develop, and even a lot of Europeans are not good enough according to the social Darwinists.
Yeah, it was a highly racist system that was set up with clear political intention. So they're using these created and constructed categories about race that they're making up at the time in order to privilege themselves and to put themselves in positions of power and authority.
And make a lot of money at
Yes,
White Earth.
and make a lot of money at White Earth and other places as well. But the legacies of those policies are still with us in many ways today.
And that's what I was just going to say. I mean, is that attitude still reflected in what John Pemberton said, in the early 1960s? That, why would the BIA go ahead and do something like that about something essential as membership? And maybe it's because they don't, really view us as being worthy of that kind of consideration. And so a kind of a social Darwinist attitude. And is that attitude still, reflected today in things like the Oliphant Supreme Court case that says Native nations don't have criminal jurisdiction over non-Indians? So, have we really turned away from assimilation policy, or is it just kind of evolving in different ways?
Yeah, I think we see lots of evidence of that, and I think your connection between the termination time period in 1961 is spot on, because I think the letters that the MCT has been receiving from the Bureau during that time period are not so thinly veiled threats to termination. And so I think in many ways the tribe is probably those elected leaders at that time are pushed, you know, with their backs up against the wall in some ways. Like, you can either accept this blood quantum, which will, over time, the government is hoping over time that will eventually cause less and less people to have the legal and political status of being American Indian, therefore absolving the U.S. government of its responsibilities. And or you can sort of choose to let us terminate you today. It's like, well, what are the choices really here? It's very, very limited, and it's clearly the Bureau getting deeply involved in serious tribal. The fundamental power of any nation is determining its citizens. That's
correct. And you know, and definitely seems to go against what was the given reasons for the IRA. We're going to strengthen your sovereignty, but however, 25 years later, they're kind of, you know, regenerating assimilation policy, you know, arguably.
Yeah. Great. Thank you for everyone who is tuned in to watching us. We're broadcasting live from Fond du Lac Tribal and Community College. This is our Get Informed, Get Involved Watch Party series, and we have guest David DeGroat from White Earth with us today. We've been talking about a range of issues. I see a couple questions coming in. If you have questions, please jump in and ask them. We have a question here about, is the same philosophy of social Darwinism, is social Darwinism related to the doctrine of discovery?
Well, I think so, definitely. It just, you know, our American doctrine of discovery, you know, Chief Justice John Marshall kind of glommed on the Catholic Church's discovery doctrine and incorporated it into American law. And he specifically says in that the discovery of this continent was different because of the nature of the people here. They were savages whose occupation was war, who got their living from the forest. So social Darwinism, they made it seem empirical, scientific, and that's because in Europe they're going through this second Enlightenment phase where, you know, this, if you ever heard of Charles Darwin sailing to the Galapagos Island and, you know, cataloging everything, they're really getting into like nerd hands-on science in Europe at that time. So it's kind of trendy to reduce everything to science. And at the same time in the United States, there's of course slavery, and they use social Darwinist ideas to justify slavery. So this is where you get the fire eaters in the southern states in the antebellum era actually saying, and they actually really meant it, that they're doing a favor to their slaves by enslaving them because they're children, and you can't just let children do their own stuff. And they maybe they actually believed it, maybe it's just this huge psychological guilt thing that they're doing. But they do the same kind of psychological process for Native American policy. So John Marshall, those statements that these people are savages, they get their living from the forest, their occupation is war. How could he say that about the people who taught the Pilgrims how to farm? How could he say that about the people who developed corn, which today, according to the United Nations, about 60% of the world's food comes out of the Western Hemisphere, It comes out of pre-Columbian America, and corn is the leading grain worldwide. And we only have corn because our ancestors were so good with their environment. They developed that excellent grain through farming. So they apparently had enough time when they weren't fighting wars to do this really hard farming work.
Very sophisticated
And,
systems that people that
whereas the Pilgrims, I don't know what they were doing. They were raising turnips or something, I guess.
Right.
And
not
so,
very successfully.
I mean, and John Marshall was product of his times, but he grew up, you know, in the Revolutionary War era. He was kind of close to George Washington. But he would have been aware of Benjamin Franklin's statement about the Iroquois that, you know, if 6 nations of savages can do this, we can do it. And they're talking about the Articles of Confederation and U.S. Constitution. So as far as social structure too, John Marshall should have known that, well, these guys had the Great Law. They had a representative form of government before us. So Marshall's probably lying in Johnson versus McIntosh when he applies the discovery doctrine to American law. But it's probably the same reason the racist slave owners are lying. It's they do have a moral structure, a value structure that they claim to govern themselves by in Europe, and they don't want to violate that value structure. But at the same time, you're not going to turn the money away. It's you want that stuff. You know, you're not going to be poor. You're not going to be St. Augustus. So what do? You make an excuse for it. So the savage nature of natives and the discovery doctrine, I think that's just like the attitude of social Darwinism, that scientifically these people aren't legally competent because of their race. So yeah, I think that's a really good question because it links those 2 periods of history.
Yeah, thank you. Excellent. Please keep the questions coming in. Thanks for logging on and joining us today. We've been covering a range of topics connected to the formation of the Minnesota Chippewa tribe and a lot of underlying history that's behind that. The Minnesota Chippewa tribe, as we've talked about, is created in 1936 in accordance with the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, which, as David has shared with us, you know, in some ways is the U.S. pivoting to recognize tribal sovereignty, but in another way still facilitates the assimilation goals and policy that the U.S. had been heavily involved in prior to that era as well. And we've just been discussing a little bit about some of the various other acts, the Nelson Act, as well as some other court cases that have an impact. And so we have a question here. I think we have some time to start moving into some of the differences between the original Constitution in 1936 and what we call the MCT revised Constitution, voted on in 1963 and signed by the Secretary of Interior in 1964. And so we've mentioned 2 of those. The 2 big ones are the big change in membership or citizenship requirements, implementing that 1/4 Minnesota Chippewa Indian blood. And then other big change related to representation in the governing body, getting rid of that system of delegates and only going to a tribal executive committee governing body with 2 representatives, the chair and secretary treasurer from each reservation. You want to talk about other changes or elaborate on those at all?
those are the ones I usually talk
So
about.
the main
because
ones.
those are because by the time you talk about them fully, you don't really have time for much else. I think that what's interesting is it's a single, body government, the TEC. So it doesn't have a judicial division. So it isn't executive, legislative, judicial, like some governments. And I think it's interesting the TEC opinions concerning the Constitution. So, opinion 180, opinion 181, 182. And, I think that's an interesting way of interpreting your Constitution. Generally that would be done by courts.
Right.
But, I think it's opinion 182, gives the opinion that the Constitution allows TEC and RBCs to create courts.
Yes.
So, that to a certain extent, arguably that power has been delegated to courts. But it's interesting that the TEC interprets the Constitution, as a unicameral, government. So I think that's interesting. And, I've heard some people say that's hens guarding the fox guarding the hen house kind of thing. But, I'm not quite so sure. Just because the United States government is structured that way, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's the only viable way that it can be done. So that's interesting, and that's more of kind of a evolution of the Constitution than an explicit change.
Yeah, and that's relatively, like you were saying, it's relatively unique to have a governing body also during the interpretation.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a good thing to point out that people might be interested in. We've also seen some other changes to the Constitution across time. Would you care to mention any of those changes?
I can't think of the big ones.
I'm kind of thinking of, yeah, we have, but then also in the 1970s where we get the change for representation.
Yeah, yeah. And then in the 2006 the felony conviction. Yep. And then was a part of the 70s was 18 to
the
vote,
voting.
21 to serve office. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Yep. And I don't know how they did it before that. I don't think there were any 16-year-olds that were ever elected in like the 1950s. I wonder if it came up as an issue and that was why they did those changes. Or
that one I'm not sure, but yeah, I do think the one...
Especially the 70s ones
yeah.
I've always been curious about. Yeah.
I think the one with representation that's significant that has changed, even like you were talking about the TEC interpretations, that's not really a Constitution change, but it's kind of an evolution of how the government has worked over time. And when we think about the change in the 1970s to you can only run for office on the reservation of your enrollment, prior to that, you could run for office on the reservation where you lived. And so we did have many people who have their enrollment on a reservation but live on another reservation and could run for office there, could and did. And it's in the 1970s where we see that shift. And I think some people see that as a move toward, as you talked about earlier tonight, the way we see each of the reservation governments operating more and more autonomously across time.
Oh, that's a good point.
So I think sometimes we might point to that as perhaps a connection to that. We think
that's a good point. And I know other people have talked about that kind of evolution and that you know, if there is an evolution, it does seem to be more, not necessarily independent RBCs, but RBCs with more defined powers, I suppose. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yep.
And yeah, that would be an interesting, like, part of that evolution. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's always struck me as so common sense that you would live where you also govern. Yeah, I've
Yeah.
never really spent much time on that one, but yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah. Excellent. So I think we've covered a number of the things here, just keeping an eye on our feed. As we wrap up, we've got just a couple minutes to go here, and I think you've provided us a great deal of history spanning the Minnesota Chippewa tribe. I'm thinking, is there anything that we've left out that you want to be sure to get in that we haven't covered?
No, I'm sure there is, but I can't. You put me on the spot,
Sorry.
and I can't think of it.
You'll think of it when we end this
when I'm
video.
driving home, I'll think of it.
I'll make notes for next time of other things, and we'll look forward to a number of future conversations where we'll delve into the current Minnesota Chippewa Tribe Constitution in a little bit more detail, and talk about some of the specific clauses that we see coming up and some of the things that other people might have questions on. So I think with that, I will say miigwech for your time today and sharing your thoughts and ideas and history about us. There's so much to know about the Minnesota Chippewa tribe. It is a unique structure, and there isn't a whole lot. There isn't like a really great history of the Minnesota Chippewa tribe that's easy for people to read and access.
Well, you've got a ton of good stuff, and the MCT website has a ton of good stuff, all the old ordinances and stuff, and yeah, I use them in my class. And
Excellent.
but the last bound book, I think, is 1978. They did the history of
that. Are you thinking of that blue book with the embossed?
Is it blue? Yeah, it has some of the graphics in it. It's about 200 or 300 pages long.
Oh yes, yeah. So there's a few, but so we have a PDF of that on Zaagibagaang.com, and so there's stuff out there. Some of it is some digging, but it's also good to take the time to read the ordinances, like you said, read the original Constitution, read the current Constitution. So check out.
And generally, where that stuff would be boring in a different context, it isn't boring for us usually, because it actually is about us. So, you know, some of my students at the tribal college, and I've taught at UND Law School too, and I'm not saying anything about my law students at UND, but some of my students at the tribal college, they know more Indian law than those law students, and some of them know more than some of our local judges too. And so, you know, it is stuff that's interesting because it's about us and it affects us. And
Absolutely.
When you look into it really deeply and think about it and deconstruct it, you can change your mind. I've had students change their mind about like significant things.
Yeah, that's the power of learning, and it's important for us, like we said, to get like the title of our series, get informed and then get involved. And so please check out those resources. Miigwech to David, miigwech to Liz, and the whole team in the studio here. We're working to get our next session scheduled. I don't have that for you yet today, but keep an eye on our Facebook page for an announcement. Thank you. Gigawabamin.